Now going to introduce you to Miss Katrina Crowe, who's the curator of the first Thought Talk. So thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, everyone. Welcome back again. RT is back in the news again. This time it's about their new strategic plan, which contains ominous proposals to move Fair City and the Late Late Show out of Montrose, which is, shattering tradition in so many ways, and also about their new funding mechanism, which looks set to give us the worst of all worlds. Over the last year, we've heard a great deal about RT's governance and financial troubles, but very little about programming, which is the lifeblood of any broadcasting enterprise. What kinds of programs do we want our national broadcaster to produce? Why is there not more excitement about this question? Do any of the grandstanding politicians on the Public Accounts Committee care two damns about this most essential question of all? I doubt it. They certainly never gave any indication of it in all the endless stuff that went on for so long last year and earlier this year. After all, RTÉ continues through all the misery to provide us with excellent news coverage and first-class documentaries, not least the one that went out last Monday night on the villain of Galway, Dr. Eamon Casey, who was up to far more than we thought he was up to. But it took a long time to make that documentary, and it costs money, and that's the kind of thing we want our public service broadcaster to give us. But in a country full of amazing writers, why do we not have world-class TV drama? To discuss these fraught and important issues, we have Marie Hourihane, TV critic for the Irish Independent, and Dr. Roddy Flynn of the School of Communications at DCU, with moderator Mei-Ling McNamara Lecturer in Journalism at the University of Galway. Those of you who are hoping to see Patrick Frayne, who writes about TV for the Irish Times, will be disappointed, as I am. He has been stricken with illness and unfortunately couldn't come today, so we hope we'll have him some other time. Anyway, we have three wonderful people to talk about all of this. They're going to provide us with some ideas about content for our beleaguered national broadcaster. Please welcome Marie Hourihane, Dr. Roddy Flynn, and Mei-Ling McNamara.
Can I pour you some water? I need to get some of this.
I'm going to be mother.
So how about that Paris opening ceremony yesterday, huh? Thank you all very much for coming. Welcome to our first Thought Talks today on what is on the telly. My name is Mei-Ling McNamara, and thank you both so much for joining us today. What I sort of thought we could do is kind of start with a little bit of our, just kind of a few minutes from each of you, just on sort of thoughts or ideas you have, kind of about what is really going on at the moment with public service television. Where are we now? Moving on from the RT scandal, we still have to talk about it. Nothing exists not in context, right? But sort of where are we now? Following this Future of Media report, what and how do we fund public service media? Does the content that we're seeing on telly at the moment, is it really reflecting the audience that we have and the changing audiences we have? And another thing I'd love to speak about kind of is, what does diversity on television look like? So we can talk about all these kind of things, but first, if you want to start, Dr. Flynn, it would be great to hear from you.
I'm going to do it by evading the question in a way about the specific focus on what is it that what should be provided for us, right, on public service media. And I'm going to evade it so that I can come back to it. And perhaps, over the course of the hour, I think that we'll do that. Because for me, the context in which that occurs, and I suppose in particular the kind of the funding context, and I bang on about this all the time, but I do it because I think it really matters, is vital to understand and to critique before you can sort of start getting into. You have to pay for this stuff, right? And how it gets paid for really matters. And we had a sort of decision this week on how we're going to fund RTE for the next 3 years, which I don't really think meant anything, to be absolutely honest with you. Numbers plucked from nowhere, literally from nowhere. And a commitment which, as I understand it, can't even legally actually be committed to by this government, because this won't be the government in 2 years' time. We don't actually have multi-annual funding in Irish politics at the moment. We could have it, but we don't have it. So it felt like another just buying time. You know, we need to say something. This is something we can say, so we'll say this and maybe hope it goes away. It didn't go away. And why do I think this matters? Why do I think the funding stuff matters? Television's terribly expensive, right? Much more so than radio. I remember when RTÉ first started doing television in the 1960s, it was immediately said, look, the television stuff is going to cost 12 times as much per hour as the radio stuff, right? And some of the most valuable public service media elements are not just expensive, but they might actually be regarded in some corners as almost a waste of money. And to give an example of that, I mean, let's take the example of the Bishop Casey documentary. That could have resulted in nothing. It would have been actually okay if they had spent a lot of money investigating the various stories about O'Casey, and at the end of it, they concluded, actually, there's nothing to see here, right? That wouldn't have been money badly spent. That would have been money establishing that there was no story, but that we can tick that one off. And a consequence of what happens when you're not thinking that way would be to bring us back to about, say, 10 years ago, to the Mission to Pray documentary. That kind of crucified RTÉ's current affairs department for the guts of, a year or 18 months. And this was a documentary, for those of you who don't recall, where RTÉ's Primetime Investigates essentially accused a Catholic priest of having raped a teenager in Kenya, having impregnated her, and then having disappeared, which turned out not to be true at all, right? And that literally cost RTÉ in every conceivable sense. They were fined 250,000, I think, euro by the BAI. They spent an undisclosed sum in an out-of-court settlement to the priest, but probably the guts of £1 million. And the thing about that story was the priest in question had said, look, I'm willing to take a paternity test here to prove I'm not the father of this. And RTÉ said, we're proceeding, right? At that stage, you could pretty much say what you liked about the Catholic Church, and it was probably true, right? Turned out not to be in this case. And Noel Curran, who was then the Director General of RTÉ, now the head of the European Broadcasting Union, was asked about that. Why did you go ahead? And RTÉ in general were asked that question, and the answer was we had spent a lot of money on making that show, and that probably slowed us down in thinking about whether we should proceed or not. We had invested that money, and so we have to go ahead. But in that particular case, investing in public service activity, using current affairs, and the fact that they were constrained in how much they could spend and how much they couldn't afford to fail, if you like. They couldn't afford to not have a show in that slot, made them kind of basically rush ahead. So funding matters for public service media. Funding for Irish public service media is not in 24 where it was before the crash in 2008. RTÉ's best year ever in terms of its revenues, 2007. It took in about 440 million euro in that year. I think that's about 200 million of that came from the license fee. 240 million came from commercial funding. 2008 happens, the financial crash happens, and not just for RTÉ, but for all commercial media, advertising revenue basically tanks. RTÉ's last annual report, I think they took in about 154 million in commercial revenue. Still a substantial sum of money, absolutely, but it's 100 million less than they had. What's more, the license fee in 2008 was 160 quid. The license fee in 2024 is 160 quid. And there has been, overall in that period, there has been inflation. The license fee, if it followed inflationary patterns in that period, would be €197.40 as of today, but it's not. And the reason it's not, incidentally, is not because RTÉ haven't asked for it. They consistently asked for it and made a case for it over the course of the 2010s, and were supported by the then Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, who year on year said RTÉ should receive that increase so that they can do their job, so they can fulfill their public service remit. And minister after minister just went, no, no, no. And what you kind of got was this drip feed of stuff from people like Richard Bruton and more recently from Catherine Martin, of sort of filling in the gaps in RTE's funding, like the boy sticking his finger in the dike, right? Just kind of holding it back and just getting us kind of just far enough. But the consequence is a broadcaster which has a very specific mission, right? To constitute a critical element of the public sphere in Ireland. And this is literally written into legislation. But funnily enough, not the piece of legislation you might think. It's not in the Broadcasting Act, in the 2014 Competition Act. Ireland has a very concentrated set of media markets. Doesn't matter if it's broadcasting, print media, doesn't matter what it is. They're all quite concentrated. That's not that surprising. We're a small country. We're not a huge market. And the Competition Act of 2014 sort of tolerates this with regard to media, with regard to media in general. But it says that the thing that protects the public sphere is the health of the public service broadcaster. It's literally written into the legislation. It's something that has to be taken into account by the Competition Authority or the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. So it's vital that we have a well-funded public service broadcaster or public service media in general. And right now we don't, and I don't believe that we got one as a result of the decision this week. And I can come back later, because I don't want
Yes, we will come back to you later.
To why I think this specifically affects the kind of content that RTE is producing, is not producing, more to the point, and maybe should produce.
Thank you. Anne-Marie.
Well, the first thing I have to say is I'm not the TV critic of the Irish Independent. I'm one of the TV critics of the Irish Independent. I have to go to work on Monday. That's very important. I'm actually very interested in how we are handling this, both how the media is handling the crisis in RTE and how we, the public, are handling it. Because everyone talks about public service broadcasting, but nobody seems to be interested, not the journalists certainly, and not the politicians, in investigating what actually is public service broadcasting. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so thank you. There isn't, I'm not a kind of, I think that a lot of what is happening in RTE is at such a point now that when I'm actually shocked by what I discovered when I went to investigate a little bit for this talk today. Because everyone says, oh, it's young people, they don't watch television and all this. But I'm talking to my friends, right, who are retired couples. They don't watch RTE either. I was talking to my mates who are a married couple on Thursday. They watch maybe the RTE news. Here's their news day. They start their day watching Al Jazeera. Then they watch.
I worked for Al Jazeera.
What?
I worked for Al Jazeera.
No. I mean, it's absolutely fine. But I'm just saying.
No, I'm teasing.
It's a bit extraordinary if you're saying Newark at 8:30. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And they really like it. So they start at Al Jazeera. They might then watch the RTE news at 6 o'clock. Then they go to Channel 4 News at 7 because they go to bed early. They don't hang around for any other newses.
Interesting.
They never watch prime time. They say if there's a big prime time on, they'll watch it on the player afterwards. They stream all the time. They're currently on season 6 of The Americans, which they really love, right? So, I mean, this is like, I'm there going, well, these are not teenagers in their bedrooms, you know. These are pillars of the community. She said that if she pays her license fee, she shouldn't have to watch advertisements, right? And that the only thing she'd pay to watch would be BBC iPlayer, if it was here. He said, they're big sports people, he said he won't watch any sports program on television, you know, these pay-per-view things. He won't watch anything that's sponsored by the betting companies, which I thought was interesting. So if those ultimate, you know, extraordinarily respectable people don't watch RTE, Archie's in serious trouble, which it is, as we all know. People at the other end of the scale, from news and very respectable streaming series, I call the Americans like posh telly, right? And I don't voluntarily watch posh telly a lot. I'm a comfort telly person. So my comfort TV is produced in America or the UK. So, Gogglebox, Vera, those kind of things. That's not done in Ireland. If it's a drama, it's a crime drama. If it's a light entertainment show, it's a franchise from the BBC, like Dancing with the Stars. Strictly was my safe place. Unfortunately, that's not working out too well at the moment. But I just feel that RTE somewhere along the line, I don't even know if it's useful to discuss where and when this happened, but has lost contact with how Irish people live. And I find it really patronising and infuriating. Even though I love Home of the Year and watched every single episode because I was reviewing and I was completely addicted to it. But it's very patronising that they think that they can just shove us really strict formats on property and food, And what property? There's nothing, as Mei-Ling raised with me, there's nothing on rental property. There's nothing on how to do up a rented flat. There's nothing to help with the situation my niece encountered where they couldn't find the landlord and there was mould growing up the walls. 4 young girls off the North Circular in Dublin, none of them from Dublin. So I'm very conscious I'm talking to a very strong, vibrant city, which is outside Dublin. And people outside Dublin have complained for years that it's not covered, and rightly so, Now, my mum, who's 91, watches the Today Show with Daithí, and she watches Tommy Tiernan, who she fancies, and she's very upset that Daithí and Maura and Tommy Tiernan have gone for the summer. But there isn't a whole lot for that age group either. I mean, if we're thinking about a morning programme, wouldn't that be great? I know there are morning programmes on other stations. So I just feel that there's a whole lot going on in Ireland that it's like RTE doesn't even know it's going on. And I will close this section by saying that, to me, my suspicion is that what has gone on in RTE is a problem that's deep in our culture, in other areas, the health service, just because my suspicion is we are seriously talented, creative people. And I'm sure no one in Galway needs persuading of that. But I think we're absolutely useless at management. And I think that RTE has kind of collapsed under the weight of its own fear. And as the programme makers, over the last 20 years, as the number of programme makers and the status of programme makers in RTE has gone down, my suspicion is, and I can't prove this because I was looking at the independent review of contractor fees, which was published in May. And it's very difficult to say who is a manager and who isn't a manager. They only go up to grade 3 in the managers. But then there's personal contract managers, and there's 66 of them. I don't know. Is that the top executives? I don't know. But my suspicion is the number of program makers and their status and authority within the organisation has gone down. And the number of managers, I don't know what you think about this, Roddy, and the number of managers.
I work in a university, trust me, I know how that
There
works.
we go. The number of managers has gone up.
no
And
comment.
this comes down to, have I gone on too long? Can I just say one thing?
Oh no, please go on.
And this comes down, I don't know if anybody has ever read a book called Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber.
It's great.
It's a great, great book. It's a great book. Yeah. It's a bit repetitive, but it's well worth repeating. And his idea is, he was an anthropologist and an anarchist. And anyway, his idea was, in medieval times, pretty much, how you, and this mainly applies to men, how you signalled your authority and your importance was the number of people you had under you, right? So the number of soldiers, perhaps, that you had under you. And he says that that idea that belief has just been transferred to management. So if I'm a manager and I have 2 people under me, I'm kind of small fry. But if I'm a manager and I have 50 people under me, that is, I'm big beluga in Irish terms, where the companies are quite small. So that is my suspicion about what happened in RTE. But as I say, I think there is something else at the heart of this. And I think even the way the media is covered, I am a media person. I'm a journalist. But I think the coverage has been very bad because it's all been screaming and shouting, and it hasn't been analysis. I think the academics have been asked for the analysis in occasional articles and occasional appearances. But I think it's been very, very poor. That's all I have to say this time.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you both. I think I'm sensing some themes here, and one of the ones I was thinking of, both you were talking about, is risk. This idea about RTE failing to take risks in its content towards its audience. And, Roddy, if you can kind of elaborate a little bit about what it might look like with a different funding model or different structure on how they could better take risks within that. Do you think funding is part of that, or structurally thinking about commissioning more independent production companies to create content that might allow for more diverse content?
Okay, so there's 2 things there, and I'll come back to the commissioning thing. So I think that actually a public service broadcaster should be allowed to get it wrong more often than a commercial broadcaster should. When I say get it wrong, I mean a commercial broadcaster legally has an obligation primarily to its shareholders to make money, right? And that means obviating risk where possible, and that probably means doing the safe thing. And we sort of saw this in the longer history of Irish television. We sort of saw this when TV3 came along in the 1990s. And this isn't me bashing TV3. I think it's done some really good work.
But if a recipe works, keep doing it, kind of thing?
Kind of. Yep. So, like, when TV3 got its license back in 1988, and I'll come back to RTE, I promise, that we were told this was going to be the most sort of dramatic shift in the kind of the cultural framing of the nation since the establishment of RTE, or possibly since the establishment of the nation. I don't know. And then TV3 came along, and the first thing they did was they went after stuff that RTE already had that was popular. So they went after, it was sport, so they grabbed UEFA in 2000. And then in 2001, 2002, TV3 literally sold themselves to Granada Television as their 3rd bid to get hold of Coronation Street. That's how badly they wanted Coronation Street, because they knew Coronation Street had an established audience in Ireland. They'd been on RTE since 1977. And they were right. It suddenly became TV3's most popular show, and it stayed, I think, on TV. No, where is it now? Coronation Street. It's still on TV3, is it? Or Virgin 1, sorry, as it's now called. And it's interesting, actually. The second that TV3 lost Coronation Street for like a half a minute there in around 2015, when ITV Ireland started, if you remember that. Suddenly they started innovating, and they gave us Red Rock for 3 years, which was kind of an interesting, probably the most interesting drama they had done up to that point. The second they got Coronation Street back, they just went, we're grand. And Red Rock was just sort of shuffled off to the side, so they stopped doing that. But this point about, failing, on the other hand, public service broadcasters need to be innovative, right? They need to be in a position to take risks. They need to be able to look at where the society is in a given moment in time and try and ask, well, what does it probably need now? And that might mean doing something new because by definition, society changes all the time, right? So, and there's a larger point, I guess you could make about this, that we sort of have broadcasting structures that stem from the 1920s, right? So 2RN was established in 1926. That's the origin of RTE. It's massively reorganized in 1960 as the Broadcasting Act is taken out of the civil service. It's turned into a semi-state body. It's placed at an arm's length remove for the first time from the state, and I think that was a good thing. It freaked the state out during the 1960s, but you got a more kind of critical space occurring. But the space that RTE, or RTE's origins, kind of emerged from is a very particular moment in, not just Irish history, but global history. It's the beginning of mass democracy. We had just about achieved something nearly, well, approaching at least, universal franchise for the first time. We were a brand new nation, new state, and the broadcasting service was instrumentalized to those ends to try and give some shape to a very specific, it has to be said, definition of what Ireland and Irishness might mean. And to try and, I suppose, in some way underpin the kind of this idea that now everyone has some say in how the state that we live in is run. And so you get this thing, radio, that is kind of suddenly throwing a message into the homes of everybody. Now flash forward to 2024. Broadcasting is still important, print is still important, but I mean the point you're making about your friends who are not watching RTE, 15 to 35-year-olds in Ireland watch about 60 minutes of YouTube and associated video sharing platforms every day. They spend another 32 minutes on average. I actually think this feels a bit low, but these are the official stats. Another 32 minutes watching streaming platforms. They spend maybe 65 minutes watching linear TV. So they're watching less linear broadcast TV than they are the stuff that they are basically choosing to watch. 60%, this is a figure from 2019, so it's already way out of date, but the most recent one I could find. 60% of Gen Zs, so that's people born between 1995 and 2009, spend 4 hours or more on their smartphones, and of that, probably 2 hours of that is social media. Right? The point I'm getting at here is that the communicative space that we live in is not the space of 1924. And that in some respects, focusing on broadcasting, or like a public service medium, as opposed to a public service broadcaster, but a public service media company which focuses on broadcasting may be missing the point just a little bit. Or at least exclusively focusing on radio and television is to exclude a huge swathe of where public debate and conversation is taking place. And what's the implication of that? I'm actually not sure, because it seems to imply that public service media, it seems to imply something called public service social media. And I'm not sure what that is. It's not what we have. And I'm not here talking about the institutions, really. I think I'm talking about the individuals who participate in social media discussion in good faith. And how would you support that? Last thing actually on this, because again, I know I'm going on very long. Ofcom in the UK is a really interesting scoping exercise about 10 years ago. They proposed something called the PSP, the Public Service, I can't remember what the P stood for, but they sort of imagined something like what I've just described, public service social media. And they had this notion of we're going to create a 300 million sterling fund that will support people, regular punters, to provide good content in social media contexts. It got dropped for reasons I don't really understand. Maybe because it was too vague, maybe too inchoate. But that's where so much of our conversation takes place. It's where the public sphere. It's not the public sphere, but it's a huge chunk of the public sphere. And broadcasting and print can now compete with that. And as I come to that point, I realize I'm not sure I'd actually answer the question.
Should they compete? I mean, I think, can they complement each other? We do know, right, when people are watching television, they are often interacting on social media at the same time, right?
Absolutely.
So that is something that's very common amongst all generations, or predominantly 18 to 34s as well, which is let's go on let's go on Twitter or Snapchat and see what we're watching together, whether it's sport or, the Olympics. But, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the only thing I have with that is when I look at the way that broadcasters in general, and in fact I would say kind of mass media in general now, look at social media, they still see it as essentially as a unidirectional thing. They're not really interested in having a conversation. You might have a kind of viewers' comments at the end, but you don't. They're very rarely picked up upon. So it's not So the point is, we have entered a dialogic space, right, of a conversation. That's what social media. That's what the social bit means in social media. Whereas I think for an RTE, it's still basically ways of just throwing the message out and maybe dragging a few more. Yeah, and then maybe dragging in a few more eyeballs to look at the player or whatever it might be.
One of the things that I was talking to people in RT this week and last week, and one of the things that a very experienced broadcaster said to me was, look, you can make quite a good television program on your iPhone.
Sure.
So, the technology has simplified so much. And that is undoubtedly, as you say, that has to be one of the threads of what's coming. If RT is to survive, it must start incorporating the technology and the elements of that culture, of social media culture. Risk is a funny thing. Fear is the enemy of creativity, I believe, and as I say, RT is very fearful, and management has been very fearful for years. This isn't a new crisis. To me, it's not a new crisis. It's just the Ryan Tubridy thing, but the existential crisis of RTE, I think RTE has probably been dying for 20 years. And it was always, well, like any public service broadcaster, always there were huge cultural rows, huge behind-the-scenes shenanigans and politics. That was always there in RTE from the very beginning. And you had, at the very beginning, I remember watching RTE, watching F Troop and Hawaii Five-0 in Irish College in the 70s, because it was the only thing I could understand. And and the whole family sat around to watch it, and people like Bob Quinn and Leila Doolan were saying, it's too much American television. The Donna Reed show, does anyone remember the Donna Reed show? These these American sitcoms and comedies, and there was conflict about that, because they were saying, the alternative, the people who held the alternative view were saying, we're not America, actually, do you know? And that's why things like, well, I won't go to the Reardons and all the rest of it, but they were very important programs in their day, and Tolka Row and that kind of thing, because it was important. The people who ran the station began to realise it's important that Irish people can see Irish people on television. On the Risk thing and the Casey documentary, I don't think that, I heard that it was 6 years in the making, that show. And the woman who presented it broke that story. She's a Daily Mail or Mail on Sunday journalist. That's who she works for. She doesn't work for RTE. And so she's been on this story since the Casey story, since the get-go. So it wasn't even RTE generated material, as far as I can understand, unless they gave her money to do more research. I don't know. That would be my read of the situation. I don't know if it's true or not. And I haven't checked with Anne Sheridan. But the other thing, the things that were coming out of RT were, there are more managers. Sometimes when I'm in studio, this person is on radio, there are more managers. There are 4 managers, and there are only 3 people working on the show, which I thought was funny. But things like the Mission to Pray, the Mission to Pray story went through about, I don't know, I can't remember, but it was like something like 14 layers of management, and it was still mistaken. But you know, and it was raised several times when I was talking to people from RTE, but as you say, it made them really windy about going after anything controversial. And I think there is another element to this, that the relationship between RTE and politicians has always been fraught, right? Nowadays, they don't say they hate each other, but they hate each other, right? And there's conflict, always conflict. Way back to PJ Mar, actually, my friend, the sports household, she said she missed questions and answers with John Bowman. Well, I remember when PJ Mara wouldn't let members of the government go on questions and answers. They would phone up and there'd just be blanket no. And I think his reasoning was that ministers, either they couldn't cope with the attention in the media, or they could cope and they'd get too cocky and it wouldn't be good for them. That seems to have been the logic operating there. So I was really surprised, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I was really surprised at the Dole committees and so on, how little serious questioning went on. I mean, that's not good. And somebody in RTE said to me, who's very militant, they are privatising RTE. It started back in 2019 when Dee Forbes outsourced children and young people's. She just sent it to an outside operator. These are not, the name, I don't know how you feel about this, guys, but to me, the name independent producers isn't accurate, because they are not independent. They usually only have one source of income, or the majority of their income, and that is RTE. So this person was very insistent that privatising RTE, in other words, pushing everything out to outside sources, and then talking about how all the buildings in RTE aren't fit for purpose and so on. And they're not fit for purpose because RTE hasn't maintained them. If you don't maintain your house, it's going to fall down. So...
Anne-Marie, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you think, and Roddy, I love your thoughts on this, do you think that there should be more funds earmarked for Irish or more Irish-focused programming? You kind of made an argument, Roddy, earlier, that a lot of the programs are looking at more UK, US, or international sales as their broadcast, right? Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about property shows, and we're talking here about the reality of young people not able to leave their homes, of their parents.
See,
who's the audience?
I'm not really in favour of giving people a remit to say there has to be this much of this sort of programme. I'm not really in favour of that, because I think we've had bad experiences, copper fastening things into schedules, which may or may not work. I would just be instinctively against. But I would be very much in favour of saying, here's 25 million quid. You're only allowed to make programmes that are about Ireland now. You're not allowed to go to the market and buy something like Belgravia. Has anyone seen Belgravia? Yeah. It's like a down market Downton. Oh, not Downton. Bridgerton. Yeah. Only much, much worse. And
so you're arguing that there should be money earmarked?
I'm just saying...
But not prescriptive in the sense
not
of how
prescriptive,
it's done.
just say Ireland now, I don't care what it is, but it has to have happened in Ireland in the last
Yeah, interesting.
2 years.
What do you think, Roddy?
I mean, so we have the Sound and Vision Fund, which is about to have a new name, I think. So the Sound and Vision Fund has been there since 2003. They took 7% off the licence fee and gave it to the then Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, now Commission Naman. And basically, they distributed that 7%, which is probably about 15 million quid a year, to any broadcaster actually on the island of Ireland, community, commercial or public service broadcast. So RTE could apply back to the money they'd lost, if you like. And even BBC Northern Ireland was allowed to go after it, UTV. Again, it was Island of Ireland. And they had these criteria about it was to support public service and quality kind of content. And the argument that was put forward was Dermot Ahern was Minister for Communications, and he said, we've had 5 years of TV3, it hasn't produced actually anything that great, so obviously we need to kind of give this a bit of a G up. We actually need to, ironically, the market has failed, so we need to intervene in the market and give them money to do explicitly public service stuff. And the only slight problem with that was, I mean, I generally think it was quite a good idea, and it introduced some good work, but it had quite a narrow definition of what constituted kind of good stuff. And it's telling that of the money in the first couple of years, TG Ceathair alone hoovered up about a quarter of the total funding, because it was in Irish, and that was like, bang, great, well, that's clearly quality, because it's in Irish. Ipso facto, it must be great, right? And it tended to be documentaries in Irish. And some really good work got done there. I don't want to say that it wasn't. But it was quite a narrow definition. It took a while for that to kind of to get kind of broadened out. I think it was 2008 before TV3 got their hands really on any substantial money. And actually even then they lurched the other direction. His first show called Deception, I don't know if anyone remembers this. It was awful. But it wasn't great. But the thing also about, I mean, just thinking about kind of coming back to the question of content and kind of where money comes from. And so RTE does produce drama. I mean, in fact, it's broadcasting more Irish drama than probably at any point in its history. I'm open to correction of that, but I think that's probably true in terms of hours put out in the last couple of years. And so I'm going to throw out names of shows. I'm sure you'll have seen some. So there's Fair City, obviously, on a weekly basis, which is the only show RTE itself actually produces. So all the rest of the stuff is independently commissioned work. And you can help me because you'll have watched more of these than I will. So we've got The Dry, we've got Obituary, we've got North Sea Connection, we've got The Gone, we've got Kin, we've got Hidden Assets. Help me out, there must be more. I don't know.
Bodkin.
Bodkin is Netflix.
Oh, yeah. Netflix, that's right.
Smother, thank you.
Yes.
Produced by the BBC, weirdly, for RTE. And there's at least one other.
Love Hate.
I wasn't going to go back quite that far, Siún, but yeah, I mean, that's in that space too. But maybe stretch. Well, that's on BBC, so not an RTE show. Derry Girls, for anyone says, is a Channel 4 show. So I'm just focusing on RTE stuff. And at one level, you kind of go, that's great, we're producing drama. What's the problem? Couple of things. Not one of those shows is single-handedly produced by RTE, right? They're all, with the possible exception of Smother, but I'll have to check that. I suspect Smother's got money from somewhere else. Most of them have money coming from a streamer, from Hulu, from Streams, which is a Belgian streaming platform, or from basically a broadcaster in another country. And I've made this point kind of ad nauseum in some cases. So has anyone seen The Gone? Actually, a show of hands. How many people in the show in the audience have seen the Gone? I've seen it. I saw it on an airplane. I saw it on Qatar Airways between here and Doha. Weirdly, that's where I accessed it. That's also where I watched The Dry.
Okay.
But The Gone is this New Zealand Irish co-production. It's not awful. I'm not sure I see the point of it, but it says a lot more about New Zealand culture, I think, than it does about Irish culture. But it's the classic thing of two kind of mismatched cops get together to try and solve a crime. Hidden Assets, two mismatched cops get together to solve a crime. This time it's in Belgium. It is Belgium. And what all of those shows have, did I mention North Sea Connection? I think that's a Swedish co-production about, is it drug smuggling off the coast of Sligo or Donegal or something like that? Where is it? Thank you. That neck of the woods. What all of those shows have in common is that they're co-productions, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the nature of screen production in the 21st century. But it does mean that any production that RTE is interested in getting done is something that's going to have to play internationally. And sometimes that's so overt, it literally couldn't be more explicit. The showrunner for Kin, Lawrence, what's his name?
I don't know.
David? That narrows it down. He was interviewed in the Irish Times before the show came out, and he said, look, we think this is going to be great, but if this doesn't land in the States, because Hulu, I think, co-produced it, or co-funded it, we're not doing a second series. So it's not for an Irish audience, right? You just get to watch it, and it's kind of about you. But I would argue that the representation it offers is, I'm not saying it's inaccurate exactly. The casting is very deliberately kind of US friendly. So you have Charlie, what's-his-face from Daredevil. You've got Irish actors who are well known to US audiences. Aidan Gillen from Game of Thrones, Ciarán Hinds from A Rake of Things. And I think it constrains what RTE can and cannot say yes to. And my concerns is, what is the stuff that we're not seeing that they might do if they were exclusively targeting an Irish audience? And I have thoughts about this. I think we're in a point...
And where you think the funding or this idea that taking risk could come in, do you mean?
If they were equipped financially
Yes.
to actually produce a show on those kind of production values.
Yes.
Although, as you say, you can make a pretty decent show, maybe not with the microphone on an iPhone, but you could certainly, but the camera's good enough. It's 1080, it's HD vision. You can definitely produce a show for that. But if they had that kind of funding, that kind of security, again, of taking the risk, I think you could make a show that explicitly said our primary obligation is to an Irish audience. And I mean an Irish audience defined in very broad terms. I mean Ireland of 2024, not some fantastic Ireland of the 1960s that elements of the population might like to go back to. I mean, we could talk about the...
And you mean light and shade and drama and entertainment and documentary.
I'm also talking about ethnicity.
Yes, I want to talk about all sorts, all diversity. Yes.
We have 10 minutes left.
Oh, should we open this up for Q&A now? Some questions, please, from the audience. Does anyone have a comment or question? Over here, does someone...
Wait for the mic if it comes to you.
Right down here, thanks. And whoever you're directing it to, or both. Yeah?
I suppose what you seem to be describing is actually a failed organisation that doesn't have the capacity to do, that firstly doesn't understand what it's supposed to do, and then doesn't have the capacity to do it. And this has been shown over generations now in terms of public. People talk about their current affairs and news as if it's excellent, and it's not. It's dreadful. I mean, the Northern Ireland conflict destroyed their capacity to report on Northern Ireland, the most important event, possibly in the last 50 years. So they really have a problem, and it seems to me to be a failed entity. So if you were to provide the funding that the state is providing, either through the licence fee or directly, to an organisation that commissions stuff, and that had the expertise to commission stuff, would we be in a far better place in a couple of years' time?
Well, I think that's how my understanding is that's where RTE is going, that it'll just be a commissioning house. Would that be a good thing? That's the question. On the current affairs thing, one of the best, the only current affairs show that I watch regularly is Tonight. It's Tonight on TV3. Do you yeah, and it's just like this. It's just people in a studio roaring at each other. And it's not even though you were on it, Roddy, and you were very good.
Very quiet.
But most of the time it isn't even experts or anything, it's just journalists and politicians. But the two women who run it are so fantastic. I thought their discussion of the election and everything was really, really good, and it was cheap. And it's bog standard, really cheap, okay? So I just want to put that in. To be honest with you, I don't know. On the one hand, people are saying, "Oh, Channel 4 is only is a commissioning house," and they're really brilliant. But they do have a really good newsroom, and they do, they seem to have a very clear vision of what they want to do and what they have to do. And if you ask me, would I be confident? Because here's my doubt about it. The people who would be the commissioning managers will probably be the same managers who are in there at the moment. And I don't think that's a good thing. That's just me being very black-hearted about it. If it was an imaginative commissioning entity, I would be very much in favour of it, you know, because it's one of the ways to go and it would help the industry.
And Marie, would you suggest pulling from different groups, perhaps, maybe making a kind of commissioning body pulled from different sectors or groups?
Well, you know, the RTE board was pulled from different places as well. Look how that turned out. Not great. I'm so downhearted about the managerial class in Ireland and the managerial profession in Ireland, that what worries me about your proposal is who, you know, the topic that you raise is the question of who would be in charge of the purse strings and the ideas. And therefore, I can't say that I would be 100% in favour of it.
Roddy?
Just to say, I don't disagree that RTE is not a damaged organisation. And I don't want, what I tend to do, to be honest with you, is I tend to be a bit monocausal in my thinking, and I tend to look at politicians. But I'm going to have a go at politicians for a second, so forgive me. Because I don't think, so RTE is a creation, right, of 100 years of history. And really the last 50 years of history, I think, is what's interesting to me. Again, 1960 Broadcasting Act, semi-state body. For the first time, RTE isn't being run on a day-to-day basis. It's literally part of the civil service, and suddenly politics are in there. And the response in the 1960s of politicians to that was, what are you doing? And like some people I've heard about will remember people like literally Charlie Haughey ringing up a newsroom after there was an interview with he was the Minister of Agriculture. There was an interview with the head of the National Farmers Association, Richard Mulcahy, that juxtaposed the Haughey's comments unfavourably, as he saw it, with Richard Mulcahy. And he rang up and said, stop that. And incredibly, it appears that the newsroom said more or less okay. But they leaked it afterwards, and it became a kind of public kind of outcry. And then about 3 months later, Sean Lemass, then Taoiseach, says, it's right that he did that. I mean, he didn't name Haughey, but he said, it's right that he did that.
Remember when Gareth Fitzgerald got into his car and drove down to the Late Late studio? He was objecting to something that was on the Late Late, and he objected, so he got into his car and went into Montrose, and he was Taoiseach at the time, and said, no, this is all rubbish. I mean, I wish that would happen more, actually.
That was the women's programme.
Was it the women's programme?
Every feminist in Ireland was on Anna that night.
Was that what Gareth intervened in?
Yeah.
But just to finish
so interesting.
on this point, though. So your point about, say, RT's coverage of, say, the H Block and the hunger strikes, which was disgraceful, right? It might as well have been happening in Zanzibar, not 100 miles up the road. They just kind of went, and here's an event, here's an event, here's an event. And okay, there was a certain amount of, this has been going on for 10 years and we're a bit inured to the violence and all that. But I do think that was one of those things where actually a state intervention, literally 10 years earlier, had just kind of softened RTE's cough so much that they weren't going to go near it. Hear me out. I mean, you can come back if you like and kind of disagree with me, but RTE had been, when the Troubles broke out in 1969, they kind of were trying to figure out how do we cover this, because do we talk to people who are essentially part of terrorist organizations, and their conclusion was they're part of the story, we should talk to them. They were warned by the then government, look, you can't be talking to those people. RTE came back and said, can you be specific about which people we shouldn't be speaking to? And they got this issue about you shouldn't talk to people who who advocate the attaining of goals through violent means. And the RTE reasonably came back and said, do you mean the Irish Army? Do you mean the Guards? What could you just name them? And they didn't name them, and they kept on talking to members of the IRA. And after one particular interview with Sean McStephane, Chief of Staff of the West Belfast Brigade of the IRA, the then Minister for Post and Telegraphs, Jerry Collins, removed the RTE authority overnight without any consultation, just did it, fired them. Now, that stung RTE. I mean, if you talk to the people who had been, journalists who had been through that period, they just went, okay, right, we're like, and that softened their cough, I think, for a long time. Did you want to?
No, I think that's fine and that's
Yeah.
understandable at that time. My issue with their Northern Ireland coverage was the way the actual current affairs side of things was captured by the stickies. And it was, they just had lost all credibility, both in Northern Ireland and the South, through the subsequent years. That's all true, as you say, but that wasn't the issue I was...
The larger point there is that I do think RTE is a creature of the state, and I do think the state has quelled RTE consistently for 50 odd years. We didn't just get here by accident. And the last piece of evidence of that is 1965 to 2008, because of a sequence of state decisions, RTE's main source of funding is not public funding. It's not us. It's commercial revenue. Now, RTE didn't choose that. They were complaining about it in annual report after annual report from 1967 onwards. They were asking for license fee increase. They weren't getting them. They were placed into a position where they were de facto a commercial broadcaster. Even now, 45% of RTE's revenue is coming from commercial sources. The European Broadcasting Union average for a public service media broadcaster is 18%. We are off the charts in this regard. And that's not an accident. That didn't just happen. RTE didn't choose this. They were placed in that financial straitjacket. Sorry.
How are we for time? Can we take one more question?
2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Any more questions here? People dying to ask questions? Yes, please. Here, right down here. Please. Keep your hand there. Yeah, right there.
Hello. I do agree with you in relation to RTE. It is a creation of the state, and probably I would have a lot of things to say here today, but what I would say is in relation to how the media has covered how you talked about the pack, which I had the misfortune to have to sit through, but nobody questioned how this came to be, how the state is the shareholder of RTE. It is the only shareholder. And nobody questions why it has allowed this to happen. And it's in the the irony of what the politicians speak in terms of, oh no, we have to be hands off, we can't have interference. The fact is the funding of not just RTE but TG4, public broadcasting, is in a political stranglehold, and nobody seems to talk about it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
For 5 years in a row, the BAI said to the state, RTE needs an increase, and the successive ministers from Alex White through to, I forget who succeeded Alex. So it didn't matter what class of politician you're talking about. It could be Labour, could be Fianna Fáil. They all just went, nah.
Because they hate it. And it suits them to keep it weak. Isn't that right?
That's not what I'm talking about the discourse.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah, no, point taken. Point taken.
One more, maybe?
Yes, last question. Someone dying to ask in the back there.
So I come from the States, so apologies. I don't have apologies
okay.
in general, but specifically specifically when it comes to like my blind spot for licensing fees, because we don't have those there. But I've been working in television for 20 years, specifically news and unscripted documentary fields, and I've always thought that existentially, from a fundamental level, television, even radio, were always sort of designed around commercials, designed around advertisements selling you something. And that's just, kind of full stop how they were invented, mass produced, blah, blah, blah. But I'm wondering, why is it so important? Why does the onus need to fall on the licensing fees? You mentioned licensing fees not keeping up with inflation. Why is it a bad thing for the onus to fall on the advertisers? Because there would be no shortage of money to come in to advertise this, that, and the third. And, morals aside, but like betting companies, for instance, they will pay whatever to get their logo on your screen. So if there's a problem with funding, then why would it be a bad thing for more of the onus to not fall on those advertising companies?
Thank you. I think that's a
Because-
great provocative
because
question.
advertisers are, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. If to put it at its simplest, there's nothing wrong with it. But advertisers will only want to advertise on a certain type of program, would be my argument against it. Against letting it just go to an advertiser-funded station. You need if you are a public service, this is where the clash comes. If you are a public service broadcaster, you have to broadcast certain things which are not commercial and don't appeal to advertisers. So what's going to happen to those programs? Are they just going to die because you can't sell cars on them? You know, that would be my very simplistic response to that.
Have you watched much Irish TV or British TV since you've been here?
Yeah.
Okay.
But not
Does it?
most of the things I thought were Irish were Channel 4.
I don't.
Yeah.
It's not so much whether it's Irish or British. It's just when you watch it, does it not feel different to you from watching American television?
In a good way.
Thank you. So let's work that through. So BBC is, as you are aware, is more or less 100% publicly funded. Actually, about a fifth of its income comes from commercial revenue because it's very good at selling its TV programs to other stations. But actually, about 4 billion of its 5 billion per annum comes from the license fee. And I mean, the BBC is quite a populist broadcaster, don't get me wrong. But it certainly does stuff that ITV, which is a fully commercially funded broadcaster, wouldn't contemplate doing. Is exactly the point. So that's the answer to the question. That it's not that commercial advertising comes with sort of strings attached. It's not that direct. But it encourages a kind of program making, right, that you will not see in a purely, for example, publicly funded model. I mean, the examples of this are myriad. I used to teach television drama to students, and we would talk about the difference between, British television drama and American TV drama. What was the obvious distinction? If you were writing for American television, you had to write not an hour of television, but you write 48 minutes of TV, and you weren't even writing 48 minutes of TV. You were writing 4 12-minute pieces of TV, which were internally coherent and which had a little cliffhanger at the end, so you could hang on to people and they'd come back after the break, right? So it actually the commercial funding is in the DNA of the actual content. That's just a very obvious example. Why is soap opera called a soap opera? Because it was funded by soap companies. What did soap companies want? They wanted an opportunity to sell not just literally soap powder, but all the other kind of fast-moving consumer goods that were going to be available in supermarkets.
And product placement as well.
Product placement. So it's not innocent, is what I would say. Commercial funding or advertising funding. I'm also not saying that they write the scripts or anything, although they actually literally wrote the scripts in the sponsored shows in the States during the 50s and 60s. I'm sure you know this. But it does shape the feel and the content of what is and is not possible. So I think that's why it matters, where the funding comes from. If it was up to me, I'd give, and no one will like this, I would give $500 million to RTE, and I'd give it all from the Exchequer. And I'd make it hypothecated tax funding, right? A household broadcasting charge, which would be less than your license fee. I've done the maths. But that every household would pay. And that would be the funding model. And then let the rest of the commercial sector have at advertising. Give it to Virgin. Give it to whoever wants to have a go. There's 36 different companies selling advertising on television in Ireland right now. Most of them are not Irish companies. It's like it's the Channel 4s and it's the Daves and all of those companies. But let them have it, right? Yeah. No problem.
Anne-Marie, any last words too? No, thank you, Roddy. If you could wave a wand, what would you do?
What would I do?
Yeah. Or final last thoughts.
I would say I would make it a tax. I would fund it through a tax, right? And not the TV license. It was funny when I went to pay my TV license in June, the woman behind the counter said to me, "You're paying your TV license." A lot of people, she said, "We haven't had a lot of people in here recently because they're so fed up with RTE." So I hand over my 160 quid. And I just think it's not a very efficient way to fund something. So I would make it a direct tax. And I would say to RTE, you have to put in a social media aspect to that has to be part of the package, that you have to develop a social media strand, right, to engage with people. And you have to ask people for content.
Yeah.
You have to reward them when they give you content, so it's not just like a phone-in program. And I would insist that contemporary matters were covered, but funnily enough, not in documentary, because I think what's happened is that an awful lot of very good programs and very good subjects, for example, Birdsong. Did anyone see Birdsong with Hourihane? I think, I think a lot of those things could be more, but they're made into one-off documentaries. And I think a lot of content could be boosted. And similarly with T.G. Cahir documentaries, which a lot of the time, as Roddy said, are fantastic. But actually, I think they could be used, they should be explored more. So I'd put a ban on the half-hour documentary for 2 years and see what people come up with instead.
So I hear more dialogue, more risk, more vision, and more money. Yeah. Yes, is what we're talking about. So thank you both very much for your time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Well done, you.
Okay.
Thank you.